right, everyone. So we want to finish up with our notes on biodiversity. So this is section 3, the future of biodiversity, and it is our last section in our chapter on biodiversity. So we look at saving species, right? And it's not a ridiculous thing, but sometimes people argue like, does it really make an impact if we save one species at a time? So we do look at a species that's on the verge of extinction. It is an unbelievable prospect that this animal will no longer exist. So oftentimes, um, organizations, especially like zoos and aquariums, will do a number of different methods to try to preserve the individual species by breeding them in captivity. So I know I mentioned the western lowland gorillas a lot, but that is one species that's near extinct in the wild, but there are a number of them within the zoo population. One of the biggest issues then is that those organisms often cannot then be reintroduced into the wild because they're brought up, they're not used to having to fend for themselves and to defend themselves and to defend a pack. And so there are some organisms that only exist within our zoo and aquarium populations. Okay, so we look at these captive breeding programs. And so these are the programs involved in breeding species in captivity, right? And the captive breeding programs are the ones designed that maybe we'd be able to reintroduce these into the wild. And so one organism that they were successful with was the Californian condor. Okay, they were able to breed them and try to reintroduce them into their habitat. But then the question remains, they've scientists have been able to see that they're able to survive, but will they ever reproduce in the wild? Okay, or is it something that like these breeding programs will constantly just have to breed in the program and then introduce them? Okay, we also look at preserving genetic material, right? Because if a species is near extinct, there's some thought to, making sure we extract genetic material and store it. Okay, so we look at this idea of germplasm, which is a hereditary material, chromosome and genes, that's contained in the protoplasm of germ cells and can be stored as seed, sperm, eggs, or pure DNA. So there are germplasm banks to store germplasm in controlled environments for future research, especially for those organisms that are, have the potential of no longer being here. Okay. I've mentioned the zoos, aquariums, parks, and gardens before. These are living museums of our world's biodiversity. So they're here so that we can see organisms that we wouldn't necessarily be able to see and kind of appreciate the wonders of our world. But more study is definitely needed. Saving a couple, like these 3 elephants that we have here, doesn't really preserve a species, right? And it may not help it in the wild. So small populations are vulnerable because they're vulnerable to us. They're also vulnerable to infectious diseases and genetic disorders caused by inbreeding. I had mentioned in our last set of notes, the gorilla breeding program within the zoo tracks all of that so that we don't develop genetic disorders within the gorilla population. Um, we also look to preserve habitats and ecosystems, right? Because if we can do that, that's 75% of the impact, the human impact on extinction of particular species. So if we can actually preserve these habitats and ecosystems, then maybe these organisms will flourish. So we do kind of try to protect habitats of endangered and threatened species. We try to preserve large areas. Um, and that is it's very, very difficult to do. Okay, other conservation strategies. So some conservationists give priority to protecting entire ecosystems rather than just one species, right? So we're not just looking at the elephant or the lion, but as the entire, tundra that we want to protect. Okay, and in doing this, we might be able to save most of the species of an ecosystem instead of just the one that's identified as endangered. So the thought is that if one type of organism in that habitat is endangered, there's a pretty high likelihood that other ones will be on that same path. Okay. So what are some strategies? How are we going to do this? So one strategy is to identify an area of a native habitat that can be preserved, restored, and linked into a larger network. Okay. The other is to promote products that have been harvested with sustainable practices. But more studies definitely needed. So this idea of more study needed pops up a lot, right? Because we have all these great ideas, but how do they work in actual implementation? Okay? We look at legal protections. So there are laws that are passed to protect our organisms. So in 1973, Congress did pass the Endangered Species Act, and it is designed to protect any plant or animal species in danger of extinction. Okay? The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has to compile a list of endangered and threatened species in the United States. So in 2002, so it is an old statistic, 983 species of plants and animals were listed. Okay. And then what they have to do is then they have to look at it and we have to list species protected from human harm. Okay. And it does prevent the federal government from carrying out any project that jeopardizes the listed species. So once an organism is listed on there, the federal government could not go in and try to like take over their habitat. Okay. So here's just kind of a rundown of the Endangered Species Act. Okay, and some recovery plans. So the fourth provision of the Endangered Species Act is to prepare a species recovery plan. So, right, it's not enough to just list it as endangered. What is the actual plan that's in place? And so often it's to protect or restore the habitats for those species. And again, remember, we said that now we're trying to look at whole habitats and not just one individual species. Um, and it prevents real estate developers from building in certain areas, which could cause a loss of income to some people. Okay. We talk about a habitat conservation plan. We're looking at a land use plan that attempts to protect threatened or endangered species. So this, a lot of it seems repetitive because we're going through kind of the overarching concepts and then just applying terms to them. So this is where we want to protect that particular habitat. Okay, it does call for international cooperation. So the IUCN, okay, the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, does work at a global level to kind of look at species in danger of extinction around the world. And they work with organizations, it's a really good organization, the World Wildlife Fund, to protect natural resources and to stop certain things like, for example, poaching in Uganda. We do have the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and this is designed to stop that illegal poaching. Okay, so we see that their first effective effort was to stop the slaughter of African elephants because African elephants were being killed simply to get their ivory tusks. Okay, and so one of the first things that they did was to get a ban on all sales, imports, and exports of ivory, hoping that that would solve the problem. Because if it is illegal to do that, it makes it harder for the poachers then to make money on it. Um, Now, some people did argue that if you made it illegal, it would actually increase the rate of poaching, right? Because people would be doing it illegally. But after the ban was enacted, the price of ivory dropped and therefore the poaching declined because people weren't making as much money on it anymore. Okay, we also look at the Biodiversity Treaty. So this is an international agreement aimed at strengthening national control and preservation of biological resources. So what is its ultimate goal, right? We want to preserve biodiversity. Fair enough, and the fair use of genetic resources in all countries. Okay, so it did take several years to be adopted by the US government. So there are definitely some political groups. So there are political groups that are going to object to every single law that goes into place. But what this looked at was the economic and trade agreements that would impact biodiversity. So that hit for some people because anytime you influence an economic and trade agreement, it does typically influence money, right? And so there's going to be a loss of money, which is going to make some people very angry. There's also private conservation efforts. So something like the World Wildlife Fund is a private organization. It survives on donations from people. I donate to the World Wildlife Fund, and it encourages the sustainable use of resources and just supports wildlife protection. So, guys, ultimately with biodiversity and protecting biodiversity is really the idea of balancing human needs, right? Because there are things that we need to survive. But we want to make sure that we are not putting ourselves above all other organisms in a way that we're causing the destruction of species, right? An endangered species might be a source of food or income, but we have to weigh that against the species' role in the overall ecosystem. Okay, and so that's the end for Unit 3. or part 3 of this unit. And so we're finishing up with our biodiversity. So I hope you'd enjoyed it, and I'll see you in office hours.